Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. We are post-bye week, and we're getting ready for another matchup for the Nittany Lions this Saturday, 3:30 kickoff in Beaver Stadium. Kent State coming in. It's been a squad that has been beat up a bunch early on this season. 71-0 thrashing at the hands of Tennessee last Saturday. A loss to FCS opponent St. Francis a couple weeks ago. We'll learn more about Kent State, what Penn State is preparing for in a matchup they are massively the favorites for. Once again, we know what happened with Bowling Green. Didn't come close to that 5-touchdown spread. Ends up being a dogfight. But if this one ends up close, then we're going to have a lot of questions about this Penn State squad. But before we get teed up for the matchup later this week with some more podcasts, we're going to look back at how Penn State is coming out of this bye week with some player updates, a few different notes from members of the staff that we were able to catch up with during the week away from game action. And to do that, I'll bring on board Daniel Gallen to start this latest game week on the Penn State schedule. It's game week number 3 out of 12 here in the regular season. There will be 2 bye weeks. We're already through one of them. And Daniel, hope the bye week treated you well. I know you were on the move just like I was. We're now back in Happy Valley. We're out of James Franklin's press conference, and we're right back into the swing of things.
Yeah, I mean, I survived a fall wedding, and if I can do it, anyone can do it. So no excuses. Get out there. But yeah, I mean, the bye week timing is really weird, but worked out. I think for both of us personally, and I think for Penn State, it also came at a good time in terms of self scouting, setting things up, and Big Ten play just kind of looming and getting a little closer and closer.
Penn State is now at number 10 in the Associated Press top 25 poll. They're number 9 in the coaches poll. They were listed at number 8 in those polls coming out of their victory over Bowling Green. Of course, when you're idle for a week, other teams have a chance to impress. Daniel, what did you make of some shifting in those rankings within the top 10, where Penn State is kind of viewed coming out of week 3, and ultimately what that means right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that anytime you don't play, it's kind of like the only thing that can happen is you can go down. That's really how these polls work sometimes. I think Penn State is probably where we would expect them to be. I do think that if they handle business against Bowling Green the way that we thought they would and the way that we expected they would, then maybe they're in that 6-7 range. I know that the one thing last week that surprised me was getting jumped by Mizzou in the AP poll, where Mizzou hadn't played anyone in those first 2 weeks, but had looked really, really good doing it in the process. I think they started the year with back-to-back shutouts, and that's something that makes an impression. All these rankings, you take all of them with a grain of salt, and we're only human. I've never voted in these, but I can imagine that it's kind of difficult to keep track of everything going on. But I do think this is where Penn State slots in right now. I think that maybe we get to November and this Bowling Green team is the class of the MAC, and maybe that game looks a little bit different and you interpret that result a little differently. But if you struggle with a MAC team while Tennessee is hanging 70 on another team from that same conference, that's just kind of how things go right now. But I do think that this is a top 10 team in terms of talent, everything around it. And as of right now, they're still being respected that way in the polls.
Penn State right there at number 10. They started off in the preseason poll at number 8, which is where they sat tight after the first couple of victories. One very impressive on the road at West Virginia, one not so much at home against Bowling Green. And you look at now USC crept right on the doorstep of the top 10 now with their strong start. They're number 11 in the country. That mid-October matchup looks a bit different, but just kind of working through the Big Ten presence here, Daniel. And the last team I'll mention will kind of tee us up for a different topic that just popped up here on a Monday. But here's what you've got. Texas is the new number 1 team after Georgia struggled a bit. They're number 2 now, are the Georgia Bulldogs. But Ohio State leads the way among Big Ten teams at number 3. Then you go to Oregon, number 9. Penn State at number 10. USC at number 11. You've got Michigan at 18. Nebraska at number 21 with a strong start for them. And then number 24, and just around the corner here in Happy Valley, the Fighting Illini of Illinois. It's a team that we saw come into Beaver Stadium few years back, stunned a lot of folks with a 7 overtime. Was it 9 overtime victory?
9 overtimes.
9 overtimes. And then last year wasn't really smooth sailing for Penn State. It was a matchup ultimately that they prevailed with a relatively comfortable margin, but it wasn't a start to finish kind of dominance. Overall, Daniel, what are you making of the Big Ten's presence nationally at this stage? I think the number between Big Ten and SEC teams is 16 out of the top 25. James Franklin said that's pretty much what he anticipated, which is with what college football as kind of the direction it's moving right now. What do you think about the Big Ten presence, Penn State's spot in all of it? And lastly, Illinois popping up in these rankings here in mid-September.
It is kind of crazy. And I think that the point that James Franklin made was that it wasn't just these conferences getting bigger, which if you get bigger, you're more likely to have more teams ranked. He's mentioned the quality of opponents that or quality of programs that these conferences added. And you talk about that with the SEC, with Texas and Oklahoma going in, the Big Ten adding USC, Oregon, Washington, UCLA. I know that Washington was ranked to start the season before they lost in the Apple Cup over the weekend. So it is what you expect. I mean, it is jarring to when you have it. I have it up right now, and it's SEC, Big Ten, SEC. Like you kind of throws you for a loop a little bit, and it kind of drives home the point that a lot of people have talked about, where it's sort of the power two and everybody else. I know that the Big 12 and the ACC are doing whatever they can to hang around, but there is definitely a gap there. We'll see how that bears out with the playoff. I think that a lot of people have said, well, I don't know if the SEC or Big Ten can get more than 3 teams in. But when you look at these rankings, and who knows how the committee is going to go about things, maybe it doesn't seem as far-fetched to have more than 3 once we get there. But we'll see. But I think with Illinois, I think it's a cool story for them. We know that Brett Bielema has really been trying to build up that program. I know that it was the 2020 season finale. He'd been announced as the new coach, and he was up here in Happy Valley, I think, watching that game, which Penn State really shut the door on 2020 in pretty emphatic fashion, and in a way that was, you could tell that it was something that they were kind of ready to be done with it. But I think that Illinois has done some interesting things. They do play number 22 Nebraska on Friday night in their Big Ten opener. So we'll see if they're still ranked. If they win that when they get here, that's a road tilt in Lincoln. Kind of an intriguing Friday night game. I think that it's a lot more on my radar now than it was a couple weeks ago. But I think it's an interesting team. I've had Illinois games on the second screen or in the background the first 2 weeks of the season, and I'd look up and Luke Altmaier is making a crazy pass. Their defensive backs have been really, really active. It's a really intriguing program right now, and I think that they're headed in a positive direction. But as we've talked about, there are tiers in these conferences, and Penn State, I think you would consider them to be a tier above Illinois. So how does that look when Illinois has to go play against one of the big boys?
Yeah, there's not a lot of sleepwalking allowed on the conference schedule this year or in any future years for Penn State football. And in fact, we know when there was seemingly maybe some sleepwalking in play against the MAC opponent a couple Saturdays ago, what that looked like. And so got one more non-conference matchup here. Again, you're favored by more than 40 points against State. It's a matchup we'll talk about later this week, but it's hard not to start peering around the corner at what's going on in this conference. And, head coaches, when they're on the mic and the playoff conversations comes up and the conference conversation comes up, if you're in the SEC and the Big Ten, you probably should take these opportunities to say what James Franklin said, which was, when you look at the depth of this conference and the volume of quality teams in this conference, there's going to be a real case to be made for maybe leaving out a one-loss team from another conference that didn't have the same journey and maybe didn't have the same competition in favor of a multi-loss team here in the Big Ten. And I know Bud Elliott made a pretty strong case when he joined us in the preseason in August. And if you don't follow Bud, he's part of that Cover 3 podcast. He does a national analysis for 24/7 Sports and CBS. He was pretty confident that the Big Ten was going to be in a spot to get 4 teams in. And when you look at his latest playoff projection, which came out today here on a Monday, he's got 4 in. He's got Ohio State as the number 1 overall seed. He's got Penn State as the number 6 seed, hosting Ole Miss for a Peach Bowl rematch. That would be in Beaver Stadium the weekend before Christmas. And then he's also got Oregon at 8 and USC at 10. So two of those Pac-12 transplants getting into the playoff as Big Ten representatives in year one. But we won't go too far down that playoff conversation because there's a lot to focus in on right now. And when we're looking at what's directly in front of our faces, Daniel, there are some player availability conversations being had coming out of the bye week. And that starts with KJ Winston, a guy who's routinely been projected as a potential first-round pick in the 2025 NFL draft. He was the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week in Game 1 against West Virginia, 12 sacks, 7 of them were solo, also had a forced fumble on the day. And he is somebody that we've heard, being routinely mentioned as a vital leader for this defense, not just a team captain, but someone who is a heart and soul presence at this defensive backfield. Daniel, he exited early against Bowling Green. We didn't see him return to game action. He didn't have his helmet on the sideline. We didn't see them go deep down that depth chart at safety. It was Jalen Reed and Zakee Wheatley the rest of the way, with Cam Miller playing a lot more in that line position, which Jalen Reed had played before. No updates from James Franklin today, but he says he's probably going to have one for us coming off the practice field on Wednesday. Before that happens, of course, we'll be looking for KJ Winston on the practice field. We did not see him last week when we got onto the field. Daniel, what do you make of KJ Winston's lack of clarity here and the fact that James Franklin drew a line between that and Dejan Lane, the freshman who's already been announced as a green light? He wasn't going to, keep his red shirt this year, but Franklin went out of his way a few times in discussing KJ Winston's situation and saying he is the focal point for them right now. When you talk about developmental pieces on the depth chart, they know what they've got in Jalen Reed and Zakee Wheatley. Those guys both neared 70 snaps last game. They're going to continue to play a lot, says James Franklin, but they need other guys to rise to the surface, and Lane is the one that he kept pointing to.
Definitely. I think after the game, coming out of it, we talked about how it was maybe a little surprising that after KJ Winston left, that Penn State just rode with those two safeties, Wheatley and Reed, the rest of the way. There wasn't any dipping into that depth. There wasn't any rotations on the back end. I know Franklin mentioned that there was some hope that maybe they would get Dejan Lane out there against Bowling Green, and it didn't quite go that way. I know we were expecting to see him out there, but it is necessary, I think. We know that Penn State in the past has really liked to rotate these defensive backs, these safeties too. I know that Reed and Winston really locked down starting jobs last year, but if you're going to be playing three safeties a lot of the time, that sort of raises, you're going to need more, because if you've got three guys out there, that's, another guy you have to account for on the two deep or as a backup. And so we'll see. I mean, I think that Dejan Lane is someone we've heard really, really good things about. Looking at him on the field, he really looks like he belongs. It's obvious why he was greenlit, even though he didn't get here till the summer, which is always an interesting dynamic. But I think with KJ Winston, it really does feel wait and see. We'll see Wednesday night. He's not someone that I would rush back for Kent State. I think that you have to take the long view here. James Franklin has talked about how long this season is and has the potential to be, with how the playoff has expanded. But I would be really curious to see what Dejan Lane can do. I know that we've talked a lot about depth, and it's getting tested in some really interesting ways on all three levels of the defense. I know that we've talked about what's happened in the front seven before, but then you look at that safety group and you move to Kari Nelson down the linebacker. King Mack left in the offseason. Lamont Payne is in his first year at the position. Tyrese Mills has been around and bounced between positions. There's not really guys who have had a really straight line trajectory at the position outside of Winston and Reed. Even Wheatley had to switch positions earlier in his career. So it is interesting. I think that that's something that probably snuck up on us a little bit, that depth situation at safety as well, because of the focus we had on the front seven. But I'd be really curious to see how much run Lane can get Saturday.
King Mack, who you mentioned, making that move to Alabama really, made this a different situation than we projected it to be. It felt like he was pretty obviously going to be the answer of who's the fourth safety, going into 2024, coming out of spring ball. The former top 100 recruit transfers after spring ball. He ends up in the SEC. And then Dejan Lane shows up in June, and all of a sudden here we are 3 months later, and he is the next name out of Franklin's mouth. And we can name a few others. You did there. Tyrese Mills, in fact, is the only other safety aside from the 4 we've already mentioned who's entered the game. Just like Lane, he saw 3 snaps in the season opener. No non-starting safeties played against Bowling Green, which is a shocker considering how we thought that game was going to go from a personnel standpoint. But you mentioned Dinkins, Lamont Payne making their move from cornerback to safety during the offseason. Vabu Torre is another true freshman in that room. But when you had one of your 2023 signees move on after a year in King Mac and another one of them move from safety to linebacker in Dakari Nelson, you can understand why there might be a little bit of a lack of clarity on who is fully prepared and ready to seize the moment. We'll see if Lane can do that against Kent State and moving forward. Another freshman news that came out of today's press conference with James Franklin, which you can see in its entirety at Lions247.com. Luke Reynolds, we can officially take off the kid gloves with him. He will burn his red shirt. The green light all the way now. We figured that would be the case. We discussed it our last episode of this podcast with Andrew Rapplier being confirmed as a long-term injury absence. And it was Luke Reynolds who started in his absence against Bowling Green a couple Saturdays ago. Reynolds, of course, made his debut at the college level 1 week earlier with about a dozen snaps against West Virginia. We've discussed this a bunch, Daniel. It is Tyler Warren, and then there's a gap. It's not like it's been in the past where 1A, 1B, but we've seen Penn State utilize multiple starters at the tight end spot back-to-back weeks. It was Rapplier in week 1. It was Reynolds in week 2. And this is where I throw in a big caveat. It's fun to get excited about Luke Reynolds, and we continue to hear great things about him and what he can mean for this team. But Khalil Dinkins has been back for a couple weeks now. He's also gotten back in a game. He had a catch on 3rd down that moved the chains, and he's somebody that going into August was legitimately viewed as a weapon for this attack. And so to me, if he's got some stability underneath his feet now coming out of the bye, Dinkins is still someone that you need to be paying a lot of attention to, whether it's as a starter or getting a bunch of those reps. This isn't to me that now by default we're looking at Luke Reynolds as tight end too. I still think he's got a lot to contend with Khalil Dinkins, as those two guys are noticeably ahead of a redshirt sophomore Jerry Cross and redshirt freshman Joey Schlafer.
Yeah, I think when you look at the tight end spot coming into the season, we were really curious about what the usage would look like because we talked about it, that this was really not, this wasn't a 1A, 1B type year. This was a 1, 2, 3 with Tyler Warren at the top. And I was curious if it was going to be reflected in that. And they come out with 2 tight ends to start both of these games to begin the year. And I think that shows that Andy Kotelnicki wants to use these tight ends and use these different personnel groupings. I think that philosophy also means that you're going to need 3 tight ends to play with different groupings, different things like that. I mean, Tyler Warren also, you have to give him a break sometimes too. It doesn't always seem like that, but you're going to want to have depth behind him as well. So Dinkins, I feel like, is still going to see significant time. I think Reynolds is obviously going to be a piece of this. Dinkins was someone, when you talk about the bye week and health and things like that we thought this could be a really important week for him. James Franklin termed it as knocking the rust off against Bowling Green, getting out there. And now with another week, maybe we can see him be a little bit bigger piece against Kent State. But yeah, I think that for Luke Reynolds, I mean, I think this is a testament to both his talent and also how he's worked since he's gotten to Penn State. I think it's one thing to be the 5-star, but it's another thing to come in and be the 5-star who changes his body composition and does everything that the staff asks of him to put himself in that position to play. So I think that the more depth, the better. And I am curious to see, without Rapplier and with Dinkins becoming a little bit more healthy, how this works behind Tyler Warren moving forward.
Reynolds hasn't seen a target yet, but that's a part of his arsenal as a pass.
Hasn't seen an official target.
Hasn't seen an official target. He was targeted on a play that was wiped out by a penalty in week 1 against West Virginia. So thank you for the correction there, Daniel. He did see the ball come his way in a college uniform, but we'll see if next time it counts and if next time he can come down with the football, make a play, and really work off of there. He's a guy that also has gotten a lot of rave reviews for his willingness to put on those 30 pounds and block guys with it, which is not always an easy transition for wide receiver type tight ends at the high school level jumping into the Big Ten. Another name we got to get to here, Daniel, is Caden Saunders. like Luke Reynolds, he's a former top 100 recruit. Unlike Luke Reynolds, there's some distance between him and his recruitment now. We're going back a few years. Caden Saunders, part of that 2022 wide receiver class, which has really been under the microscope this year in a few different ways. And he is somebody that, a couple of weeks into August, we were speaking with on the Penn State practice field. We were speaking about with Penn State staff members, and there was legitimate, momentum, it seemed, on his side as a year 3 player. Last year, never really came together consistently for him on the offensive end. He caught a late touchdown against Ohio State. Was kind of a roller coaster ride in terms of his reps at the receiver spot. He spent the first half of the season as your punt returner before Daquan Hardy surged and starred in that role, but solidly regained his status as the punt returner at this preseason camp. Was a guy that we were hearing, mentioned quite frequently as a threat out of the slot, someone that Andy Kotelnicki could use and devise in space to showcase some of those skills. Unfortunately, Daniel, he did have a medical setback at some point in August toward the earlier part of that month, and we didn't see him for a stretch there. When he did resurface on the field, it was just some practice work that we got, and then when the games came, no offensive snaps through 2 matchups. He's been the punt returner. It seemed like against West Virginia, they basically sent him out there as kind of a safety valve, don't screw it up, call fair catch, just give us possessions, don't give the home team momentum. Last week, we saw Caden Saunders take it upon himself to try to do something with the football and ended up seeing a fumble as a result from that. So thus far, kind of a frustrating outlook for Caden Saunders, and I don't think it became much rosier in what James Franklin gave us for feedback today, Daniel. He said it's a lingering injury. He mentioned that word lingering a couple times, and if you're a fantasy football owner or you just know what it's like to track these health reports, lingering is not a positive word for any injury. And so with Caden Saunders, James Franklin said he himself hasn't really been able to see a lot of it on the offensive end yet because of what they're working through. I know Justin Lustig, special teams coordinator, had some thoughts on Caden Saunders last week during our call, but it just feels like this is a piece of the plan here that because of what he dealt with last month, it's been unfulfilled right now. And when James Franklin is qualifying it as a lingering issue, you just kind of wonder, when does that change for Caden Saunders?
Yeah, Franklin said that whatever is lingering is preventing him from being at 100%, which football is a tough game, and not everyone is at 100% all the time just because of the nature of it. But the further you are from 100%, just the harder everything is to do out there, especially someone like Saunders, whose game is predicated on being that quicker, shiftier, he's not the most physically imposing player. So, he has to win a different way. And if you're not 100%, it can make things pretty difficult. He is someone, too, that I think when we talked about the bye week in terms of health, we thought this could be a pretty big week for him. And to not really have a glowing report from James Franklin on where he is right now, I think that's something that you note a little bit. But, we'll see. I mean, I think that we've talked about it. I think we were all really excited to see what he could do in this offense. I know he was excited to show what he could do in this offense. And that hasn't happened through 2 games yet. So we'll see if he gets his shot against Kent State. This is one of those games where I think if he was healthy, I'd probably be penciling him in for a third quarter. Maybe he gets a pass from Bo Prabula and takes it to the house. One of those things. Later in a game like this, but I think we'll wait and see. We know what Daquan Hardy was able to do in punt return last year and how that really flipped things for Penn State and just gave them a different dimension. And we'll see if Saunders can get to a point where he can, maybe if he's not returning 2 punts for a touchdown in a game, maybe he's still at least giving an opposing special teams unit something to think about, something else to plan for.
Saunders is one of 5 third-year receivers from that 2022 class. Obviously, we've seen Omari Evans kind of pick up where he left off as a downfield threat last season here at the start of his junior year. The others who are like Caden Saunders, redshirt sophomores, Tyler Johnson got involved on the offense. Late work, but a couple opportunities for him this season. He didn't play at all in games the last couple of seasons. Anthony Ivey played a little bit in week 1, did not play in week 2 on offense, and Mekhi Flowers, same deal there. So still a lot to learn about this collection of players. Christian Driver was at one point part of that group. He's now elsewhere in the Big Ten following a transfer. And Daniel, when we work our way through kind of what Penn State was looking to accomplish this bye week, James Franklin again kind of reiterated what he told us coming off the practice field last week, and that was cleaning up penalty issues. He thinks they've been uncharacteristic with the penalties they've accrued so far. He specifically addressed that being pre-snap and post-play penalties with us at practice last week. He said third down efficiency for the offense. He's been begging out loud for them to get maybe 6 to 10 more offensive plays over the course of games to try to get the balls in their playmakers' hands more often. It doesn't feel like they've had enough plays on offense. Been a lot of explosive moments, which they've been searching for, but sustained drives. He brought that up again. And then just again, bringing up getting off the field and being efficient with your communication on defense. So again, James Franklin didn't really throw much new our way in terms of what those bye week initiatives were coming out of it, but kind of went back and emphasized all three of those points once again.
Yeah, the penalties thing stands out to me when I was doing some catch up on the weekend, listening to a couple podcasts on Sunday when I was coming back to Happy Valley. I was listening to a segment about the Washington State-Washington game, and Washington had 16 penalties for 135 yards in a 5-point loss where they had a chance to win at the end. And it's like just that idea, and just not putting yourself in those positions where you're extending the other team's drives, putting yourself behind the sticks. It's just these things that feel so minor, but can really, really add up. And I'd be willing to bet that 135 penalty yards is probably worth 6 points at least over the course of a college football game. So that was something that popped up when I heard Franklin talking about that. The efficiency piece of it is really interesting. I think that after West Virginia, we did feel a little bit of that boom or bust, the way that things were going in terms of scoring quickly or going 3 and out relatively quickly. I think that this Kent State game, like I don't really know if this is going to be the right game to string together some 10 play, 70-yard drives. I feel like this might be a game where you have some more of those 4 play, 75-yard drives just because of the talent gap that's going to be there. But I think that this is where you should be able to extend drives. You should be able to try some different things and try to put together some of those longer drives. You can try to spread out some of these touches. So we'll see what that looks like. I know that we talked about Trey Wallace going from week 1 to week 2, and sort of the statistical differences there. I think that this is where coaching really comes in, and team chemistry, and having everyone on the same page of how this is going to work. But I am curious. I do think you want to see some long drives. I mean, there's going to be some situations this year where you're going to need that 4-minute offense to win you a game. You're going to have to stay on the field and keep the other team off the field. And then the final spot with communication, I do think it is kind of interesting in terms of the helmet comms, talking about all the issues on defense, because I think that we were asking Kobe King about it. What's it going to be like to have Tom Allen in your ear? But I think a lot of the focus is always on the quarterback. That's just how football is. You want to know how the quarterback's going to handle it. And it is it isn't like a little bit of an interesting twist that it's the defensive side of the ball, not really something that we were expecting, where they've had to work through some things.
Daniel, when I just was actually double checking some stats as you were kind of going over some of that, and they are 13th in the Big Ten when it comes to penalties, 7.5 per game, that about 70 yards in penalties per contest, and they're 14th right now in the conference for for third down conversion rate. They're at 35% through these two matchups thus far. So just adding a little bit more clarity to what James Franklin said just by checking out the conference standings early on in the season. And Daniel, I mentioned that we heard from Justin Lustig, who's special teams coordinator. We got him. We got Chuck Losey, who's the team's strength coach, on for calls during the bye week. We appreciate the time that we got to spend with both of those guys. And let's start with Chuck Losey, because he's somebody that it feels like we've gotten a little bit more frequently the last couple of years, which is great, because he's the guy who has his finger on the pulse of how this program and its players are progressing, whether we're talking about a fifth year, sixth year kind of guy, or the dudes who just got to campus this summer. And the focal point of a story that you put out during the bye week, Daniel, was about those freshmen. And we know that 3 of them have burned their, they're going to burn red shirt in the offensive lineman Cooper Cousins, the safety Dejon Lane, and then, as we just mentioned, Luke Reynolds at tight end. But going beyond that group, there were some spotlight moments in Chuck Losey's interview with the media that really shed a little bit of new kind of angle on how things are going for the 2024 class.
Yeah, I think the one place that you want to start is with Cooper Cousins, Dejon Lane, Luke Reynolds. Losey said that the work ethic and the demeanor is what really stands out to him. And I think that tracks with what we've seen. In order to get onto the field at a program like this so early, you are going to have that kind of approach. But going a little further down, I thought that everything he had to say about Max Granville, the defensive end who reclassified and enrolled in late July, was really interesting. And I think that Losey was pretty candid with us that I think he said he was worried when I think legit worried was the quote, when Granville showed up, because like he said, he's working with these guys in January when they get here, or they're here by May or June. And he's able to really get them up to speed, put them into the framework, and let them go. And this was someone who is coming up a year and is showing up right before training camp. And, it's not something that Losey, I think, has really experienced or was preparing for. And Granville got here and has done everything right. He said, I'm not worried one bit about that guy. And it's because of the work ethic, personality, demeanor, and how hard he works. So I think that is a good sign for Penn State. I know that we're still in wait and see mode of when Granville can actually get onto the field. But I thought that was one of the really, really notable things that Losey said. And he mentioned that he had Granville written down as someone that he wanted to talk to us about. And then props to Mark Brennan for following up and asking, who are the other guys? Xavier Gilliam, Kenny Woosley, Tysier Denmark, and Egan Boyer. All those guys, I think, are in different positions that with different opportunities. Like Gilliam and Woosley are really far down on crowded depth charts. Boyer is someone that we know has a lot of physical work left, even with all the progress. But then Denmark is someone who, okay, if things go a certain way, maybe you need him. But I thought that those names coming up was really interesting to hear, from Losey, and with a lot of the freshmen that we all asked about. He was very informative and did a very nice job, I think, of showing us where they are in the pecking order.
I thought it was also interesting the way he addressed Dakari Nelson. Now about a month into his transition at linebacker from safety, he's a guy that we had hoped we might get a chance to see on the defensive side of the ball against Bowling Green. We know how the game flow turned out, but Nelson is someone that was brought up not just by Losey, but by special teams coordinator Justin Lustig as someone that they're seeing really wreak some havoc. Dish out some big time hits on the field in his special teams reps. And in the case of this transition, Losey said it's been a fantastic move for him. It's been a fantastic move for the team. He fits the personnel. In a blink of an eye, he's going to be 225 pounds at 6'2" plus for Dakari Nelson. And I continue to bring up him and Anthony Specca, who we heard from Justin Lustig as someone they're getting more involved in his special teams opportunities. They're trying to see what he's made out of a bit more. We've discussed that a bunch. I mean, is Tamir Robinson back this week? I think there's some optimism that the ball's rolling in that direction, that he might be available after missing the Bowling Green game, after leaving early against West Virginia. But we've only seen 4 linebackers play this season, Daniel. It's been the 2 starters and Kobe King and Tony Rojas, and you've got Dom DeLuca getting starters reps essentially as well, and Tyler Elsdon, a longtime veteran, as that 4th linebacker. So whether it's Robinson returning or a guy like Nelson or Specca making a move as the season goes on, a 4-man setup just is simply not sustainable at linebacker, especially when we get into the perils of Big Ten competition.
Yeah, you're going to need some of these guys to come along. And I think that we've heard really, really good feedback from Dakari Nelson since he made the move and how it seemed pretty natural to him. Um, but I think that we still need to see it. He still needs to get those reps on the field. And just physically, I'm really excited to see what he looks like at that level, just because he's just built differently than the other linebackers that Penn State has on its roster, with his length and everything that made him a really appealing safety prospect. I'd be excited to see what he can do when he gets into space and then spec up. I think that they'll manage his 4 games and try to be strategic about it and give him, figure out where he can add some depth, where they can use him to give some of these other guys, maybe some time on the sideline and keep them healthy, keep them rested, everything along those lines. But but getting the feedback from Lustig and Losi, I thought was good, and kind of a different window for sure, because Losi approaches things a little bit differently. And then with Lustig, we know that he has that outside linebackers and nickels coach title, but he looks at these guys through a special teams lens and can get to know them that way and see what they can do. So I thought that those are 2 more unique perspectives, as opposed to hearing from James Franklin or Tom Allen, more straightforwardly about those guys.
Yeah, we got Justin Lustig, who not only is special teams coordinator, but also worked with the linebackers closely and the slot coverage. That's over at Lions247.com, along with a full recap of Chuck Losi's conversation with us. The last takeaway I wanted to mention from those 2, and again, if you want to dive into all the details from those bi-week discussions, it's over at Lions247.com. But Daniel, Sanders Sahaydak naturally was a key topic to discuss with Lustig, because big question coming out of that game against West Virginia, big question going into the season was, could Sahaydak take the job, run with it, be successful, and make you feel good as a Nittany Lions coach and as a Nittany Lions fan when you got into narrow matchups as the season advanced? And we saw him make a couple field goals, including one from 40 plus against Bowling Green in a game that proved to be a 1-possession matchup on the final score. What did you hear from Lustig about what Sahaydak has been able to accomplish behind the scenes, and then what that latest performance might mean for him in that place kicker spot?
I thought it was really interesting how Lustig talked about the mental side of the game for Sahaydak, and I think that tracks a little bit with what we'd seen and what we'd heard a little anecdotally, that all the physical talent is there. It's just a question of putting that together and marrying it to the mental side of the game, especially at a high pressure spot, like that one. Lustig said that they felt strongly about sticking with him, even with that miss at West Virginia. But I was kind of thinking about it like like a 3-point shooter in basketball, where it's like as soon as you see one fall, then it just gets easier. You make one, you make 2. You get that confidence rolling, and I'm curious to see if that's how it is for Sahaydak. I mean, I put it in my story. I think it was 658 days between that Rutgers game when he made his first career field goal and that Bowling Green game, when he made another one. And in his career, he hasn't had too many opportunities either. I mean, he's had 7 field goal attempts in his career, and I'd forgotten about the first one, in September 2022 against Central Michigan. It was a weird end of half, like fire drill, where he was out there, tried to rush a kick and wasn't even close. And it was just one of those like really weird things where you're like, what just happened going into the half? So for him to get these opportunities and take advantage of them, I think that that's really important for him. And I think that's going to be important for Penn State. I am curious if you get into, I don't know if Penn State would put up 70 on Kent State like Tennessee did, but if they start really racking it up, do you see Ryan Barker or Chase Meyer get some of those later extra points? Do you try to get the rest of your kickers work if you do have that chance? But it does seem like right now that Sahaydak, as long as he keeps making these field goals, it's going to be his job.
Yeah, I feel like it's still a week by week monitoring with Sanders Sahaydak until further notice, but it's a nice change of pace for him, for us to be discussing his conversions and, the positive momentum, because it's been a while, as you said, since we could really point to that with Sanders Sahaydak at place kicker. Daniel, appreciate the perspective. We will be back on a bunch of player calls, more conversations with Coach Franklin and members of the staff coming later in the week. We got practice availability again Wednesday, so we'll be over at team facilities. A few more episodes of this podcast to come before kickoff on Saturday as well. You'll hear from Daniel once again, and we'll give you our updated look at Penn State and our predictions for the score of this matchup and a few other predictions as well when you hear from him next. Appreciate it, Daniel.
Thanks, Tyler.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast. You can check out our coverage of James Franklin's weekly Monday press conference, including the entire video of that Q&A over at lions247.com. Take advantage right now. 30% off gets you in for VIP access moving forward. We'll be back with a couple more episodes before kickoff on Saturday, looking ahead to the Kent State-Penn State matchup. What do you need to know about this visiting squad that has struggled mightily thus far on the 2024 season? And we'll start to set the stage for recruiting opportunities that are set to take place in Beaver Stadium this weekend with more prospects heading to Happy Valley. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.